Sigmund Freud, a comprehensive chronicle of life, theory, and the architecture of the unconscious. Sigmund Schlomo Freud was born on May 6, 1856, in a rented room above a locksmith shop in Freiburg, Moravia, a small town in the Austrian Empire that would later become part of Czechoslovakia and is now Piebor in the Czech Republic. He arrived into the world wrapped in a caul, which his mother Amalia Nathanson interpreted as an auspicious omen foretelling greatness for her firstborn son. This birth occurred into a complex family structure that would later provide the empirical foundation for some of his most revolutionary psychological theories. His father, Jakob Freud, was 40 years old, a wool merchant of modest means from a Hasidic Jewish background, while his mother was merely 20, creating an age difference that contributed to unusual family dynamics. Jakob had been married twice before, and his two adult sons from his first marriage, Emmanuel and Philip, were roughly the same age as Amalia herself. Young Sigmund thus entered the world already an uncle, as his half-brother Emmanuel's son John became one of his earliest playmates and the template for what Freud would later identify as the fundamental ambivalence characterizing all his subsequent male friendships, a mixture of affection and rivalry, love and competitive hostility. The Freud family's early years in Freiburg were marked by financial instability as Jakob's textile business declined amid the industrial changes sweeping the Austrian Empire. In 1859, when Sigmund was barely 3 years old, the family departed Freiburg, moving first to Leipzig and then, in the spring of 1860, settling permanently in Vienna in the Leopoldstadt district, a predominantly Jewish quarter. This relocation occurred during a period of gradual Jewish emancipation in Austria, when legal restrictions were loosening and opportunities in professional and academic life were expanding for the Jewish population. Freud would remain in Vienna for 78 years until the Nazi annexation forced his exile in 1938. His early childhood contained several emotionally significant events that he would later excavate through his pioneering self-analysis. His brother Julius was born in October 1857 but died in infancy, awakening in the young Sigmund intense feelings of jealousy followed by guilt that he would recall decades later as foundational to understanding the Oedipus complex. His relationship with his nephew John, who was actually slightly older than Sigmund despite being a generation younger in the family hierarchy, established patterns of friendship marked by both intimacy and competition. These early experiences within a complicated family constellation, where generational boundaries were blurred and emotional allegiances confused, provided the raw experiential material from which Freud would eventually construct his theories of family dynamics, sibling rivalry, and the Oedipus complex. Freud received a classical gymnasium education, emphasizing literature, languages, and philosophy, which would serve him throughout his career as both a scientist and a writer. He proved himself an outstanding pupil, ultimately mastering 8 languages including German, French, Italian, Spanish, English, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. He entered the Leopoldstädter Communal Realgymnasium in 1865 at age 9 and graduated from the Matura examination in 1873 with honors. Around the time of graduation, he began using the name Sigmund instead of Sigismund, perhaps signaling a shift toward a less overtly Jewish identity in an increasingly anti-Semitic Vienna. In 1873, at 17, he enrolled at the University of Vienna to study medicine, though not from any particular calling to medical practice. As he later wrote in his autobiography, he was drawn instead by a scientific quest for truth and an almost obsessive curiosity about the fundamental workings of nature and human existence. His university studies brought him into contact with several intellectual traditions that would profoundly shape his thinking. He studied philosophy under Franz Brentano, who lectured on concepts of consciousness and the unconscious that anticipated some of Freud's later ideas. He worked under Karl Claus, a Darwinist zoologist, and in 1876 spent 4 weeks at Claus's zoological research station in Trieste, dissecting hundreds of eels in an ultimately inconclusive search for their male reproductive organs, an amusing foreshadowing of his lifelong preoccupation with sexuality and anatomical differences. In 1877, Freud entered Ernst Brücke's physiology laboratory, where he would spend 6 formative years that fundamentally shaped his scientific worldview. Brücke was a towering figure in 19th-century German physiology, a member of the so-called Helmholtz school of scientific materialism that rejected vitalism and sought to explain all biological phenomena through physics and chemistry alone. Brücke, along with colleagues Hermann von Helmholtz and Émile Dubois-Raymond, had taken an oath around 1847 to establish a new biology rigorously grounded in physical sciences, pledging that no forces other than common physical-chemical ones are active within living organisms. Under Brücke's rigorous tutelage, Freud conducted microscopic research comparing the nervous systems of humans with those of other vertebrates and invertebrates. He published several papers on the anatomy of nerve cells and developed a new staining technique for nerve fibers. Freud later described Brücke as the greatest authority who had ever influenced him, praising his piercing blue eyes and penetrating intellect. The mechanistic, deterministic approach to biology that Freud absorbed from Brücke profoundly influenced his subsequent psychoanalytic theories, particularly the economic perspective on psychic energy and the concept of cathexis. Brücke's principle that living organisms are energy systems governed by the first law of thermodynamics, that energy can be transformed but not destroyed, became foundational for Freud's later psychoanalytic theory, which conceptualized the psyche as an apparatus for managing and transforming psychical energy according to principles analogous to those governing physical systems. Freud's medical studies extended over an unusually long period of 8 years as he was absorbed in research and seemed reluctant to enter clinical practice. He did not receive his medical degree until March 1881. In 1879, he completed a year of compulsory military service, during which he translated 4 essays by John Stuart Mill, demonstrating his philosophical interests and linguistic abilities. The turning point came in 1881 when Brücke, concerned about Freud's financial prospects and the limited opportunities for advancement in pure research, advised him to leave the laboratory and pursue medical practice. Following this counsel, in 1882, Freud began working as a clinical assistant at the Vienna General Hospital, rotating through various departments including psychiatry under Theodor Maynard and internal medicine under Hermann Nafnagel. This clinical work exposed him to the full range of nervous disorders and psychiatric conditions, gradually drawing his attention toward psychological explanations for symptoms that seemed to have no organic basis. During this period, Freud conducted research on cerebral anatomy, aphasia, and cerebral palsy, while also embarking on what would become known as his unfortunate cocaine episode. Between 1883 and 1887, Freud experimented extensively with cocaine, which had recently been isolated and was being investigated for potential medical applications. In his 1884 paper on coca, he enthusiastically extolled the drug's virtues, believing it could cure morphine addiction, depression, and various other ailments. He prescribed it to his friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow to treat morphine addiction, with disastrous results. Fleischl-Marxow developed severe cocaine psychosis and died still suffering several years later. Another colleague, Karl Kahler, discovered cocaine's anesthetic properties for eye surgery, receiving the recognition that Freud had hoped for himself. As reports of cocaine addiction and toxicity emerged, Freud's reputation was temporarily damaged, though he continued using cocaine himself intermittently until 1896 for depression and migraines. The year 1882 also marked a crucial personal turning point when Freud met and fell passionately in love with Martha Bernays, the granddaughter of Isaac Bernays, the chief rabbi of Hamburg. Martha came from an Orthodox Jewish family that was intellectually distinguished and socially well-positioned, though the family had faced financial difficulties. The engagement between Freud and Martha lasted 4 difficult years from 1882 to 1886, during which the couple was frequently separated, with Martha living with her mother in Hamburg while Freud worked in Vienna. During this prolonged engagement, Freud wrote over 900 lengthy letters to Martha that his biographer Ernest Jones later described as worthy contributions to the great love literature of the world. These letters reveal both Freud's passionate devotion and his complex, sometimes controlling personality. He expressed intense jealousy not only toward potential male rivals, but even toward Martha's attachment to her mother and brother. He demanded that she renounce Orthodox Jewish practices and attempted to reshape her personality according to his own ideals, yet he also wrote with profound tenderness about his love for her. The financial obstacles to marriage were substantial, as Freud's prospects in pure research were limited and his income from clinical work was modest. In 1885, he was appointed private docent in neuropathology at the University of Vienna, an unsalaried lectureship that nevertheless brought prestige and the right to give university courses. They finally married on September 13, 1886, in a civil ceremony in Wandsbek near Hamburg, followed by a Jewish religious ceremony on September 14. Freud, who had become a convinced atheist, was dismayed by the requirement for a religious ceremony and had to be hastily tutored in Hebrew prayers. Despite the difficult courtship, the marriage proved harmonious and stable. Martha later reflected that in the 53 years of their marriage, there was not a single angry word between them. They would eventually have 6 children: Matilda, born in 1887, Jean Martin in 1889, Oliver in 1891, Ernst in 1892, Sophie in 1893, and Anna in 1895, the youngest child who would become a distinguished psychoanalyst and her father's closest collaborator in his later years. The most transformative intellectual experience of Freud's early career came during his 4 months in Paris from October 1885 to February 1886, when he received a travel grant to study at the Salpêtrière Hospital with Jean-Martin Charcot, the most famous neurologist in Europe. Charcot had transformed the Salpêtrière from a custodial asylum into the world's premier center for neurological investigation, and he was particularly renowned for his work on hysteria and his dramatic use of hypnosis to demonstrate the psychological basis of hysterical symptoms. Charcot's theatrical Tuesday lectures, where he demonstrated hysterical patients under hypnosis before large audiences of scientists and intellectuals, profoundly impressed the young Freud. Several aspects of Charcot's work proved revolutionary for Freud's developing thought. First, Charcot legitimized hysteria as a genuine clinical entity worthy of serious scientific study rather than dismissing it as malingering or feminine weakness. Second, he demonstrated that hysteria could occur in men, challenging the widespread belief that it was exclusively a female disorder related to the uterus. Third, he showed that psychological trauma could produce physical symptoms, suggesting that the mind could directly influence the body in ways not yet understood by conventional medicine. Fourth, his use of hypnosis demonstrated the power of suggestion and revealed that symptoms could be both produced and removed through psychological means without any organic intervention. Freud was so impressed by Charcot that he later named his first son Jean Martin in his honor and translated Charcot's lectures into German for publication in 1886. When Freud returned to Vienna and attempted to present Charcot's ideas to the conservative Viennese medical establishment, particularly the controversial findings about male hysteria and the psychological etiology of symptoms, he met with hostile skepticism and outright rejection. His claims were dismissed as French sensationalism, and he was even forbidden to conduct research at the Institute of Cerebral Anatomy. This rejection by his medical colleagues profoundly affected Freud's sense of professional isolation and strengthened his determination to develop his own independent approach to understanding and treating nervous disorders. Upon returning to Vienna in 1886, Freud established his private practice at Bergasse 19, specializing in what were euphemistically called nervous disorders, and began working at the Kasowitz Institute treating childhood nervous diseases. His early clinical approach combined several methods: electrotherapy, which was the standard treatment of the time but which Freud found almost completely ineffective, hypnosis and suggestion inspired by Charcot, and a growing attention to the psychological factors underlying his patient's symptoms. During the late 1880s and early 1890s, Freud worked simultaneously as a neurologist, publishing on aphasia and cerebral anatomy, while gradually becoming more interested in psychological explanations for the puzzling symptoms he encountered in his practice. The crucial intellectual partnership that would lead to the birth of psychoanalysis began through Freud's collaboration with Joseph Breuer, a respected Viennese physician and physiologist 14 years his senior. Breuer had made important discoveries about respiration and the functioning of the inner ear, and he was also Freud's family physician and had helped him financially during difficult times. Between 1880 and 1882, Breuer had treated a remarkable patient named Bertha Pappenheim, whom he called Anna O. In published accounts, a highly intelligent 21-year-old woman who developed severe hysterical symptoms while nursing her dying father. Her symptoms included paralysis of extremities on the right side, disturbances of vision and hearing, a severe cough, inability to drink water, hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, and language disturbances so severe that at one point she could speak only English rather than her native German. Breuer discovered through patient observation that when Anna O., while under hypnosis, recalled and verbally expressed the traumatic memories and emotions associated with each symptom's first appearance, that particular symptom would disappear. She called this her talking cure, or chimney sweeping, terms that would become foundational for psychoanalysis. This cathartic method represented a revolutionary discovery, suggesting that hysterical symptoms had psychological meaning and could be resolved through bringing repressed memories and emotions into consciousness and allowing their verbal expression. Freud learned of the Anna O. case from Breuer around 1882 or 1883. Though Breuer was initially reluctant to discuss it fully due to complications in the treatment, including the patient's development of a hysterical pregnancy fantasy that she claimed involved Breuer, which had frightened him away from further psychological work. Through the late 1880s and early 1890s, Freud developed his own modifications of Breuer's cathartic method. He initially used hypnosis but found it unreliable, as some patients could not be hypnotized, results were inconsistent, and symptoms often returned after initial improvement. He developed what he called his pressure technique, placing his hand on the patient's forehead and insisting they could recall the traumatic memories if they concentrated. In 1893, Freud and Breuer published their preliminary communications setting out their key findings, followed in May 1895 by Studies on Hysteria, one of the founding texts of psychoanalysis. This book contained their joint theoretical paper, which included their famous statement that hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences, along with 5 case studies including Breuer's Anna O case and 4 of Freud's own cases. The book introduced several concepts that would become central to psychoanalysis: the traumatic etiology of hysteria, suggesting that symptoms arise from traumatic experiences usually dating from childhood; the concept of repression, whereby traumatic memories are banished from consciousness but remain active in the unconscious; the idea of conversion, where psychological conflict is transformed into physical symptoms; the notion of strangulated affect, where emotions that cannot be expressed become dammed up and cause symptoms; and the cathartic method of treatment through a reaction, the release of pent-up emotions. The book received mixed reviews, with some critics praising its psychological insights while questioning its scientific rigor. However, tensions emerged between Freud and Breuer over theoretical matters. Freud increasingly emphasized sexual trauma as the specific universal cause of hysteria, while Breuer maintained a more conservative position accepting multiple possible etiologies. Between 1895 and 1897, Freud developed what became known as his seduction theory, claiming in 3 papers published in 1896 that all cases of hysteria and obsessional neurosis resulted from repressed memories of childhood sexual abuse, usually occurring before age 4. He stated he had discovered such abuse in all his current patients through his analytic techniques. Freud's method was problematic, however, as he subjected patients to considerable pressure through his techniques to reproduce sexual scenes he was convinced existed based on theoretical grounds. He used his pressure technique, analytic inference, and symbolic interpretation of symptoms to uncover what he believed were repressed memories of seduction. Patients often emphatically disbelieved these recovered memories even after supposedly recalling them, raising serious questions about whether Freud was uncovering genuine memories or implanting suggestions. On September 25, 1897, Freud wrote his famous letter to Wilhelm Fliess announcing that he no longer believed in his seduction theory. His reasons included his inability to bring analyses to successful completion, the implausibility that sexual abuse was so universally prevalent that it would affect all his patients, the realization that the unconscious cannot distinguish between reality and emotionally charged fiction, and the fact that such memories did not emerge in psychotic states where repression breaks down. This abandonment of the seduction theory represented a crucial turning point in the development of psychoanalysis, as Freud shifted from believing that all neuroses stemmed from actual external sexual abuse to recognizing that unconscious fantasies and wishes, not just real events, could cause neurosis. This shift led directly to Freud's recognition of infantile sexuality as existing autonomously rather than merely as a response to adult seduction, the power of fantasy in mental life, and the existence of the Oedipus complex, wherein children have their own sexual and aggressive desires toward parents. The period following his father Jakob's death on October 23, 1896, proved to be one of the most creative and difficult periods of Freud's life. He experienced depression, cardiac irregularities, and disturbing dreams, what he called his neurasthenia. This personal crisis prompted him to undertake a systematic self-analysis beginning in 1897, which became one of the most remarkable intellectual journeys in the history of psychology. During this self-analysis, Freud methodically analyzed his own dreams, recalled childhood memories including his intense jealousy toward his infant brother Julius, his complicated feelings toward his mother, including early erotic feelings, his ambivalent relationship with his father mixing love and disappointment, and his rivalry and friendship with his nephew John. Through this intensive self-examination, Freud developed the concept of the Oedipus complex in October 1897 when he recognized in himself the phenomenon of being in love with his mother and jealous of his father. This self-analysis ran parallel to his clinical work and his voracious reading of literature, particularly Sophocles' Oedipus Rex and Shakespeare's Hamlet, both of which he interpreted as expressing universal human psychological truths about family dynamics and unconscious desires. His correspondence with Wilhelm Fliess, a Berlin ear, nose, and throat specialist who became his closest confidant during this period, provided the medium through which Freud conducted much of his self-analysis, sharing dreams, associations, and theoretical speculations in letters that Freud later wanted destroyed, but which were fortunately preserved by Marie Bonaparte. The pivotal moment in Freud's self-analysis and the development of dream theory came on the night of July 23 to 24, 1895, while Freud was vacationing at the Bellevue Hotel near Vienna. He experienced what he later called the specimen dream of psychoanalysis, the dream of Irma's injection. The previous evening, Freud's colleague Otto Reh had visited and mentioned that one of Freud's patients, Irma, still was not well, which seemed to reproach Freud for her incomplete cure. That night, Freud dreamed that he met Irma at a reception and reproached her for not accepting his solution. She complained of pains in her throat and stomach. He examined her throat and saw white patches. He called in other doctors, including Dr. M.W.L. and colleagues Otto and Leopold for consultation. They gave an absurd diagnosis involving an infection from a dirty syringe, and the dream ended with the chemical formula for trimethylamine appearing in bold type. Freud's careful analysis of this dream revealed multiple layers of meaning and wish fulfillment. The dream represented his wish for exculpation, shifting blame for Irma's illness from himself to other doctors, revenge against Otto for his implied criticism, defense of his treatment methods against doubters, and consolation that the treatment failure was not his fault. The dream employed condensation, where Irma represented several different women, including the actual patient, a friend, and Freud's wife, displacement. where guilt was transferred from Freud to other doctors, and symbolization, where the trimethylamine formula symbolized sexuality and his theoretical bond with Fliess. Freud immediately wrote down the dream upon waking on July 24, 1895, and later wrote to Fliess wondering whether someday a marble tablet would be placed on the house, inscribed with the words that in this house on July 24, 1895, the secret of dreams was revealed to Dr. Sigmund Freud. Such a plaque was indeed eventually erected. This dream analysis led Freud to his fundamental insight that dreams are disguised wish fulfillments, with every dream representing the fulfillment of an unconscious wish that has been censored and distorted by the dream work to preserve sleep and avoid disturbing the dreamer. Building on his self-analysis and the Irma dream, Freud wrote his magnum opus between 1895 and 1899, completing the manuscript in September 1899. The Interpretation of Dreams was published on November 4, 1899 by Franz Dutecki in Vienna, but was dated 1900 on the title page because Freud wanted to associate it with the new century. The initial print run was 600 copies, but the book's initial sales were deeply disappointing, with only 351 copies selling in the first 6 years through 1905, and a second edition was not needed until 1909. The book was structured to begin with a tediously comprehensive review of previous scientific literature on dreams, followed by a presentation of his method of dream interpretation featuring the Irma dream analysis, chapters on dreams as wish fulfillments and on distortion in dreams, examination of the material and sources of dreams, a detailed analysis of the dream work mechanisms, and finally a theoretical chapter outlining his model of the mind. The book introduced several concepts that would become foundational for psychoanalysis. Freud distinguished between manifest content, the dream as remembered and narrated, and latent content, the unconscious thoughts and wishes that the dream expresses in disguised form. He identified the mechanisms of dream work, whereby latent dream thoughts are transformed into manifest content, condensation, where multiple ideas are compressed into single images, displacement, where emotional significance is shifted from important to trivial elements to evade censorship, symbolization, where abstract thoughts are represented by concrete images, often of a sexual nature, and secondary revision, the dreaming mind's attempt to create a coherent narrative from the dream's disparate elements. Freud presented a topographical model of the mind consisting of the unconscious, characterized by primary process thinking, timelessness and governance, by the pleasure principle, the preconscious, material, capable of becoming conscious, and the conscious system, governed by the reality principle and rational thought. He proposed that all dreams represent wishes, though in adults these are usually disguised due to censorship, the internal prohibition against unacceptable wishes that are usually sexual or aggressive in nature. Children's dreams, by contrast, are undisguised wish fulfillments, simple and transparent, while adult dreams require interpretation due to the repression and censorship developed through socialization. Dreams use recent experiences called day residues as raw material, connecting them to deeper unconscious wishes and childhood experiences. The initial reception of The Interpretation of Dreams was respectful but muted. Critics noted both the revolutionary psychological insights and compelling case studies, as well as the lack of scientific rigor, overemphasis on sexuality, unverifiable claims, and excessive length and complexity. Reviewers included Havelock Ellis, who gave an appreciative review, and Eugen Bleuler, who responded positively while suggesting results might be due to suggestion. A Viennese paper characterized it as the kind of psychology used by poets. Despite disappointing sales, the book gradually gained recognition as Freud's reputation grew, and he continued to revise and expand it through 8 editions during his lifetime, eventually adding extensive material on symbolism and refining his theoretical exposition. In the preface to the 3rd edition, written in 1932, Freud called The Interpretation of Dreams the most valuable of all the discoveries it had been his good fortune to make. The book established Freud's core psychoanalytic method, free association, allowing patients to speak without censorship, interpretation, uncovering latent meaning through analyzing associations and symbolic content, attention to seemingly trivial details such as slips of the tongue, jokes, and random thoughts, and recognition of transference, the displacement of feelings from past figures onto the analyst in the therapeutic relationship. In 1901, Freud published The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which appeared initially in a psychiatric journal and then in book form in 1904. This work examined parapraxis, the small errors of everyday life including slips of the tongue, forgetting names and words, mistakes in reading and writing, and losing objects. Freud demonstrated that these seemingly random errors were actually manifestations of unconscious thoughts and wishes, embodying the principle of psychic determinism that no mental event is truly accidental. This book became one of Freud's most widely read works, making psychoanalytic ideas accessible to a general audience and popularizing concepts that entered everyday language. The work demonstrated that the boundary between normal and pathological mental functioning is unstable, and that the mechanisms operating in neurosis also operate in normal everyday life, making psychoanalysis relevant to understanding all human psychology rather than just mental illness. In 1905, Freud published two works that would prove equally revolutionary and controversial. 3 essays on the theory of sexuality was initially only 83 pages, but would be expanded through multiple editions, with major editions in 1915 on the sexual theories of children and pregenital organizations. The first essay on sexual aberrations distinguished between sexual object and sexual aim, discussed various perversions including homosexuality, and made the revolutionary claim that neurosis is the negative of perversion, suggesting that all humans have a disposition to perversions but neurotics repress what perverts act out. The second essay on infantile sexuality argued that children have sexual urges organized around different erogenous zones at different developmental stages. Freud identified the oral phase from birth to 18 months, where pleasure centers on the mouth through sucking and feeding, the anal phase from 18 months to 3 years, where pleasure centers on retention and expulsion of feces and bowel control becomes a major developmental issue, and the phallic phase from 3 to 6 years, where pleasure centers on the genitals and children discover anatomical differences between the sexes. He introduced concepts of autoeroticism, component instincts, polymorphous perversity, and the idea that sexual development proceeds through stages of organization. The third essay on the transformations of puberty described how adolescence consolidates sexual identity under genital dominance, with earlier component instincts and pregenital pleasures becoming subordinated to genital sexuality and directed toward another person as object. In subsequent editions, Freud added discussions of the castration complex, penis envy, and more detailed treatment of the Oedipus complex. James Strachey, the editor and translator of the Standard Edition, called 3 Essays Freud's most momentous and original contribution alongside The Interpretation of Dreams, as it revolutionized understanding of sexuality and development, though it remained highly controversial throughout Freud's lifetime and beyond. Also in 1905, Freud published Jokes in Their Relation to the Unconscious, his first application of psychoanalytic principles to aesthetics and cultural phenomena. The book analyzed joke techniques, including condensation, displacement, and double meanings, finding striking parallels to the mechanisms of dream work. Freud distinguished between tendentious jokes that serve hostile or sexual purposes and non-tendentious jokes that provide pleasure through wordplay alone. He proposed that jokes work by saving psychic expenditure, allowing the expression of repressed hostility, sexuality, or cynicism by bypassing censorship through the joke's acceptable form. This work demonstrated that the unconscious mechanisms he had identified in dreams also operated in waking creative productions, suggesting the broad applicability of psychoanalytic theory to understanding culture and art. During this same period, Freud published several of his most famous case histories. The case of Dora, whose real name was Ida Bauer, was treated by Freud in October through December 1900 and published in 1905. She was an 18-year-old woman suffering from nervous cough, loss of voice, breathing difficulties, migraines, depression, and suicidal thoughts. Through analyzing her symptoms and two major dreams, Freud explored the role of unconscious conflicts, bisexuality in symptom formation, and oral fixation. The case made crucial contributions to understanding transference, which Freud defined as new additions or facsimiles of past relationships displaced onto the analyst. However, Dora terminated the analysis prematurely, an outcome that taught Freud the importance of analyzing transference, especially negative transference, more systematically. The case became highly controversial in later years, with feminist critics arguing that Freud failed to recognize Dora's legitimate anger at the adult sexual machinations surrounding her and instead pathologized her responses. The case of little Hans, whose real name was Herbert Graf, was published in 1909 and represented the first child analysis case study, though Freud supervised the treatment while the boy's father, Max Graf, conducted the actual sessions. 5-year-old Hans developed a phobia of horses, especially horses with black harnesses, fearing that horses would fall down or bite him. Freud interpreted this as displaced castration anxiety, with the fear of horses representing fear of the father and the black harnesses symbolizing the father's mustache. The case was presented as direct proof of the Oedipus complex and infantile sexuality observed in a child rather than reconstructed from adult memories. A follow-up when Herbert Graf was 19 found him perfectly well with no troubles or inhibitions, which Freud cited as evidence for the analysis's success. The case of the Rat Man, whose real name was Ernst Lanzer, began in October 1907 and lasted approximately 11 months. He was a lawyer, suffering from obsessive thoughts about a rat torture befallen his deceased father and his lady friend, along with compulsive rituals, intrusive thoughts, and impulses towards self-harm. Freud interpreted the symptoms as reflecting profound ambivalence toward the father, anal eroticism, regression to the anal sadistic phase of development, and the use of defense mechanisms including isolation, undoing, and magical thinking characteristic of obsessional neurosis. This case provided the first systematic study distinguishing obsessional neurosis from hysteria and connecting obsessional symptoms to the anal sadistic phase. Freud claimed the treatment resulted in cure, though correspondence showed ongoing difficulties. Lanzer was killed in World War I in 1914, preventing any long-term follow-up. Between 1911 and 1915, Freud published his papers on technique, which established the standard psychoanalytic method and provided canonical descriptions of psychoanalytic procedure. These papers covered topics including the handling of dream interpretation, the dynamics of transference, recommendations to physicians practicing psychoanalysis, observations on transference love, and the concepts of remembering, repeating, and working through. These technical papers formalized principles that would define classical psychoanalysis, the fundamental rule requiring patients to say everything that comes to mind without censorship, evenly suspended attention by the analyst who must avoid selective focus, the requirement that analysts themselves undergo analysis, the prohibition against taking notes during sessions, the analyst's stance as a mirror or blank screen reflecting back the patient's projections, careful attention to resistance as manifested through silence, lateness, intellectualization, or acting out, systematic analysis of transference both positive and negative, and the concept of working through whereby the papers also address the phenomenon of transference love, genuine feelings that arise in analysis, which must be neither gratified nor coldly rejected, but rather understood and interpreted as repetitions of childhood patterns. These technical innovations transform psychoanalytic treatment from a simple cathartic method into a sophisticated interpretive practice focused on analyzing resistance and transference as the primary therapeutic work. Between 1915 and 1917, Freud wrote 12 metapsychological papers, of which he published 5 and destroyed 7. These papers represented his most systematic theoretical exposition, providing conceptual scaffolding for psychoanalytic theory. The paper on instincts and their vicissitudes defined instincts as the border between mental and somatic life, characterized by source, impetus, aim, and object, and identified four vicissitudes including reversal into the opposite, turning against the self, repression, and sublimation. The paper on repression, which Freud called the cornerstone on which the whole structure of psychoanalysis rests, distinguished between primal repression and repression proper, explained how repressed material attracts associated material, and described the return of the repressed in symptoms. The paper on the unconscious provided the most formal treatment of the topographic model, distinguishing the system's unconscious, preconscious, and conscious, and identifying characteristics of unconscious mental processes including the absence of contradiction, negation, and temporality, the dominance of primary process thinking, and the replacement of external reality with psychical reality. The paper on mourning and melancholia distinguished normal grief from pathological depression, proposing that in melancholia the loss of an object becomes a loss within the ego itself, with self-reproaches actually representing reproaches toward the lost object. Freud wrote that, in melancholia, the shadow of the object falls upon the ego, a formulation that would later inform his theory of the superego as formed through identification with lost objects. The metapsychological framework required that phenomena be examined from three perspectives: dynamic, considering conflicts between forces; economic, considering the distribution and transformation of psychical energy or cathexis; and topographic, considering the location of processes within the mental systems. In 1916 and 1917, Freud delivered 28 lectures at the University of Vienna that were published as introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. These lectures became Freud's most popular and widely translated work, selling 50,000 copies in German during his lifetime. The lectures were divided into three parts: the psychology of errors, covering Freudian slips and demonstrating psychic determinism and unconscious motivation; dreams, covering wish fulfillment; dream work mechanisms and the technique of free association; and the general theory of neuroses, covering symptoms as meaningful compromise formations; libido theory, including the oral, anal, sadistic, phallic, and genital stages; resistance and transference; and the goals of analytic therapy. The pedagogical approach was elementary and almost conversational in style, addressed to both physicians and educated laypeople, anticipated common objections, and used extensive examples to illustrate concepts. The lectures acknowledged the limitations of psychoanalytic knowledge while making accessible the core concepts that Freud had developed over the previous 2 decades. In 1913, Freud published Totem and Taboo, his first major application of psychoanalytic theory to anthropology and culture. The book consisted of 4 essays examining Australian Aboriginal totem systems, the concept of taboo and its relation to ambivalence and obsessional neurosis, animism and the omnipotence of thoughts, and finally his controversial theory of the return of totemism in childhood and the primal horde. Drawing on Darwin's speculation about early human social organization, Freud proposed that in the prehistoric past, brothers in a primal horde killed and ate the alpha male father who had monopolized the women. The primal patricide was followed by collective guilt, leading to the establishment of prohibitions on killing the totem animal as a father substitute and the establishment of exogamy to prevent the incest that had motivated the murder. Freud argued that this prehistoric event explained the origin of religion, morality, and social organization, and that the Oedipus complex was universal, with individual development recapitulating human evolutionary history. The work extended psychoanalytic theory beyond individual psychology to explain fundamental aspects of human civilization and culture. Initially received as an anthropological classic alongside works by Tyler and Fraser, the book was later heavily criticized by anthropologists, and the primal horde theory is now generally rejected by scholars. Nevertheless, totem and taboo established the foundation for psychoanalytic social theory and the application of psychoanalytic concepts to understanding religion, culture, and social institutions. By 1902, Freud had begun gathering a small group of interested physicians and intellectuals who met weekly at his home at Bergasse 19 in what became known as the Wednesday Psychological Society. This informal group would eventually evolve into the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in 1908. Early members included Alfred Adler, Wilhelm Stekel, Otto Rank, Sandor Ferenczi, and others who would play important roles in the development of psychoanalysis. The first International Psychoanalytic Congress was held in 1908 in Salzburg, establishing psychoanalysis as an international movement. In 1910, the International Psychoanalytic Association was founded with Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist from Zurich whom Freud had designated as his heir apparent, as its first president. Freud had been particularly eager to have Jung, who was not Jewish, lead the movement to prevent psychoanalysis from being dismissed as a Jewish science, a concern reflecting Freud's awareness of anti-Semitism in European academic and medical circles. However, the movement soon experienced its first major splits. In 1911, Alfred Adler broke with Freud over theoretical disagreements, particularly Freud's emphasis on sexuality, which Adler found reductive. Adler developed his own system called individual psychology, emphasizing social factors and the will to power or striving for superiority rather than sexual drives as the primary motivation. The break with Carl Jung came in 1913 and was personally devastating to both men. Jung had developed theoretical positions increasingly incompatible with Freudian psychoanalysis, rejecting Freud's emphasis on infantile sexuality and the Oedipus complex, proposing instead concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and psychological types. Jung's interest in mysticism, religion, and spirituality also conflicted with Freud's scientific materialism and atheism. The personal relationship between Freud and Jung had been intense, with Freud viewing Jung as his adopted eldest son and crown prince, making the rupture especially painful. Freud wrote his essay on the history of the psychoanalytic movement in 1914, partly to defend psychoanalysis against what he viewed as the heretical deviations of Adler and Jung, and to establish his own priority and authority over psychoanalytic theory. To protect orthodox psychoanalysis, Freud established a secret committee in 1912 consisting of his most loyal followers, including Carl Abraham, Sandor Ferenczi, Ernest Jones, Otto Rank, and Hans Sachs, who were charged with defending psychoanalytic principles and ensuring the movement's continuity. The outbreak of World War I in August 1914 profoundly affected Freud personally and intellectually. Initially, like many Europeans, he felt a surge of patriotic enthusiasm, writing that this was perhaps the first time in 30 years that he felt Austrian. However, this enthusiasm rapidly turned to disillusionment as the war's horrors became apparent. By November 1914, Freud was writing that he and his contemporaries would never again see a joyous world, that it was too hideous. The war had several direct personal impacts. His two sons, Jean Martin and Ernst, served in the Austrian army. His practice shrank dramatically as patients disappeared and international colleagues became enemies. His financial situation became precarious, and the international psychoanalytic movement fractured along national lines. In 1915, Freud published Thoughts for the Times on War and Death, analyzing the disillusionment of civilized Europeans and arguing that the war revealed primitive, savage, and evil impulses of mankind that had not vanished but merely persisted in a repressed state in the unconscious. The war demonstrated that civilization was far more fragile than Europeans had believed, that the instinctual renunciation required by civilization was unstable, and that under certain conditions the veneer of civilization could rapidly dissolve, releasing destructive impulses. Freud's treatment of soldiers returning with shell shock, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, proved theoretically significant. These men experienced traumatic nightmares in which they repeatedly relived horrific battlefield experiences, seemingly contradicting Freud's theory that dreams are wish fulfillments and that mental life is governed by the pleasure principle. The clinical puzzle of traumatic repetition, where patients seem compelled to repeat traumatic experiences rather than avoid them, could not be explained within Freud's existing theoretical framework and necessitated a fundamental revision. In 1920, Freud published Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which marked the most significant theoretical revision in the history of psychoanalysis. Written in 1919 and 1920 in the aftermath of World War I, the work introduced the concept of the death drive, or thanatos, alongside the previously established life drives, or eros. Freud proposed that all organic life has an innate tendency toward destruction, self-destruction, and return to an inorganic state, famously declaring that the aim of all life is death. He introduced the concept of repetition compulsion to explain why traumatic experiences are compulsively repeated in dreams, symptoms, and life patterns despite causing pain, a phenomenon that seemed to contradict the pleasure principle. Freud revised his drive theory fundamentally, fusing sexual and self-preservative drives into eros and contrasting them with thanatos, the death drives. He engaged in far-reaching biological speculation, proposing that living cells possess an instinctual energy compelling them to return to a state of non-existence. Freud's daughter Sophie died in early 1920 during the book's revision from Spanish flu complications, though Freud insisted this personal tragedy had no relation to the book's content. However, recent scholarship has demonstrated that Freud was evasive on this point, as an entire new chapter, the longest in the book introducing the concept of the death drive, was added after Sophie's death, and the term death drive first appeared in Freud's letters just weeks after she died. The work received mixed reception even among Freud's followers, with Ernest Jones noting it was the only one of Freud's works that received little acceptance from his followers, and Jacques Lacan calling it unbelievably ambiguous and almost confused. Despite controversy, Beyond the Pleasure Principle represented the zenith of Freudian metapsychology and fundamentally altered the direction of psychoanalytic theory for all subsequent work. In 1921, Freud published Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego, applying psychoanalytic theory to mass movements and collective behavior. Drawing heavily on Gustave Le Bon's work on crowd psychology, Freud explained how individuals and groups acquire a sense of infinite power and act on impulses they would otherwise curb. He argued that groups are held together by libidinal ties, with members identifying with each other through their shared relationship to a leader who replaces their ego ideal. Freud analyzed permanent organized groups like churches and armies, where a leader serves as an idealized figure and members identify with each other through their equal relationship to this leader. The work served as a transitional piece between Beyond the Pleasure Principle and his next major theoretical statement, The Ego and the Id, published in 1923. This latter work represented Freud's most important structural revision, introducing the tripartite model that replaced his earlier topographical model of conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. The new structural model consisted of the id, the unconscious reservoir of instinctual drives, both hereditary and repressed, operating on the pleasure principle and seeking immediate gratification, containing what Freud called the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. The ego, the rational reality-oriented component that mediates between id, superego, and external world, operating on the reality principle and postponing satisfaction for self-preservation, and the superego, the moral component containing internalized parental authority and societal norms, acting as conscience and prohibiting drive. Freud recognized that the ego itself is partly unconscious in its defensive functions, not just the id, and that anxiety originates in the ego rather than automatically arising from the unconscious. This structural model became foundational for all subsequent psychoanalysis and influenced the development of ego psychology and object relations theory. In April 1923, Freud noticed a painful lesion on his palate but initially kept it secret, reluctant to quit smoking his 20 cigars daily. When he finally consulted physicians, he was diagnosed with squamous cell carcinoma of the palate caused by his lifelong cigar smoking. The first surgery in April 1923 was poorly executed by a rhinologist whose competence Freud had previously questioned, performed in an outpatient clinic under primitive conditions where Freud sat in a kitchen chair covered in blood and suffered hemorrhage afterward. His daughter Anna rushed to his bedside, beginning a 16-year vigil as his primary caregiver through the ordeal of cancer. A second major surgery in October and November 1923 was far more extensive, removing much of the soft palate and throwing the nasal cavity and mouth into one, requiring Freud to wear a prosthesis he nicknamed the monster that was often unbearably painful and made speech and eating difficult. Between 1923 and his death in 1939, Freud underwent 33 operations, plus endless X-ray, radium, and diathermy treatments, in addition to an experimental vasectomy in November 1923, based on Eugen Steinach's rejuvenation theory, which Freud hoped might retard the cancer's growth, but which had no effect. Despite this extraordinary suffering, Freud continued seeing patients and writing until his final months, producing some of his most important works during the 16 years he lived with terminal cancer. In 1926, Freud published Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety, representing a major revision of his anxiety theory written partly in response to Otto Ranke's The Trauma of Birth. Previously, Freud had believed that anxiety was an automatic consequence of repression, with repressed libido transforming into anxiety. Now he argued the reverse, that anxiety in the ego causes repression rather than resulting from it. He introduced the concept of signal anxiety, with anxiety serving as a signal to the ego of potential danger, prompting defensive action before trauma occurs. He distinguished between realistic anxiety arising from external dangers and neurotic anxiety arising from internal instinctual dangers, and identified specific danger situations that trigger anxiety, including loss of object's love, castration anxiety, and superego punishment. The work elaborated on ego defense mechanisms including isolation and retroactive undoing in obsessional neurosis, building on concepts that his daughter Anna Freud would systematize in her 1936 work, The Ego and the Mechanisms of Defense. In 1927, Freud published The Future of an Illusion, his psychoanalytic critique of religion. He declared religious beliefs to be illusions, fulfillments of the oldest, strongest, and most urgent wishes of mankind, though not necessarily false but lacking basis in reality. He argued that religion stems from childhood feelings of helplessness and vulnerability, leading to a longing for protection by an omnipotent father figure, with God representing a projection of the father image onto the heavens, perpetuating infantile dependence. Freud identified religion's purposes as protecting humans from nature's terrors, reconciling them to death and fate, compensating for sufferings imposed by civilization, and providing a moral framework and social control. He expressed hope that humanity would eventually outgrow religious neurosis and embrace scientific rationalism, though he acknowledged religion's role in maintaining civilization. The work was written partly with his friend Pastor Oscar Pfister in mind and represented Freud's most sustained engagement with the psychological origins and functions of religious belief. In 1930, Freud published Civilization and Its Discontents, perhaps his most influential cultural work, and certainly his most pessimistic assessment of the human condition. The central thesis held that civilization requires instinctual renunciation, particularly of sexual and aggressive drives, creating permanent discontent and guilt. Freud wrote that the price we pay for our advance in civilization is a loss of happiness through the heightening of the sense of guilt. The work fully developed the concept of aggression as a primary drive and external manifestation of the death drive, with humans having an innate inclination to aggression, prompting Freud's famous observation that man is wolf to man. He explained that civilization manages aggression through internalization, redirecting aggression inward to form the harsh superego that punishes the ego through guilt for both actual transgressions and merely fantasized ones. This unconscious guilt is often experienced not as guilt per se, but as discontent, anxiety, or vague unhappiness. Freud conceptualized civilization itself as representing the struggle between eros, the life instincts binding individuals together, and thanatos, the death instincts seeking destruction. Written in the post-World War I context, with the growing Nazi threat becoming increasingly apparent, Freud offered a profoundly pessimistic vision, concluding with what he called the fateful question of whether societies will succeed in mastering the disturbance of their communal life by the human instinct of aggression and self-destruction. He offered no consolation, and the work stands as his mature statement on the fundamental conflict between individual happiness and social order. In 1933, Freud published new introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, a series of 7 lectures numbered 29 through 35 as continuations of his 1916 to 1917 lectures, though these were never actually delivered but written in lecture form during the summer of 1932. The lectures updated his theoretical positions for educated lay readers, incorporating developments since the earlier lectures, including revised dream theory, the structural model of id, ego, and superego, updated drive theory and anxiety theory, the psychology of women, and a philosophical discussion of psychoanalysis' status as science and its relationship to other worldviews. The final lecture on Weltanschauung declared that psychoanalysis has no independent worldview but belongs to science, rejecting both religious and Marxist worldviews as incomplete or illusory. The lectures were more polemical than the earlier series, reflecting Freud's growing sense of psychoanalysis as an established movement facing opposition from multiple directions. On May 10, 1933, Nazis organized book burnings across Germany, and Freud's works were prominently thrown into flames. When told of this, Freud quipped that what progress we are making, that in the Middle Ages they would have burned me, but nowadays they are content with burning my books. The Nazi threat became increasingly serious throughout the 1930s as anti-Semitism intensified in Austria and the Nazi Party gained power. Despite the growing danger, Freud remained determined to stay in Vienna, underestimating the Nazi threat even as Austrian Jews faced increasing persecution. On March 13, 1938, German troops entered Austria and Hitler annexed the country in the Anschluss. Freud wrote in his diary simply, "Finis Austria," the end of Austria. Within days, brown shirts raided Freud's apartment and publishing house, and his savings were confiscated. On March 22, 1938, Anna Freud was arrested and interrogated by the Gestapo for an entire day. This finally convinced the 81-year-old Freud that he must leave Vienna. Ernest Jones, the Welsh president of the International Psychoanalytical Association, flew to Vienna determined to arrange Freud's emigration, working with Marie Bonaparte, who contributed financially and used her diplomatic connections, William Bullitt, the U.S. ambassador who applied diplomatic pressure, and remarkably with Anton Sauerwald, the Nazi commissar assigned to liquidate Freud's assets who had studied under Freud's friend and protected him. The process took 3 months and required enormous sums as ransom. Before leaving, Freud was required to sign a document stating he had been treated well by authorities, to which he allegedly asked sarcastically whether he could add that he could most highly recommend the Gestapo to everyone. On June 4, 1938, Freud, his wife Martha, and his daughter Anna left Vienna on the Orient Express, traveling through Paris and arriving in London on June 6, 1938. They were received in London like conquerors, with Freud later recounting to Jones that during the journey he dreamed he was landing at Pevensey, where William the Conqueror had landed in 1066, and that he was almost tempted to cry out, "Heil Hitler," for forcing him to England. Tragically, Freud's 4 elderly sisters, Rosa, Marie, Adolphine, and Pauline, lacked the connections to escape and remained in Vienna. All 4 were murdered in Nazi concentration camps in 1942, victims of the Holocaust. The Freud family settled at 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead, London, which is now the Freud Museum. Despite his terminal cancer, Freud's final year proved remarkably productive. His daughter Anna arranged his study and library to recreate his Vienna consulting rooms, and he continued seeing patients until the final stages of his illness. He completed Moses and Monotheism, his final and most controversial book, which he had begun in 1934 under the Nazi threat in Vienna, but had hesitated to publish fearing the Catholic Church's reaction. After reaching the safety of London, he completed it as his swan song, writing literally from his deathbed. Moses and Monotheism presented revolutionary and highly controversial claims. Freud argued that Moses was not Hebrew, but an Egyptian nobleman, probably a follower of Pharaoh Akhenaten's monotheistic worship of Aten around 1350 BCE, and that Moses led his followers from Egypt but was subsequently murdered by them in rebellion during the desert wanderings. He proposed that the monotheistic god of Egyptian Moses later fused with Yahweh, the volcano god of a Midianite tribe the refugees encountered, and that the biblical Moses is a composite figure with the original murder excised from collective memory. Freud applied psychoanalytic concepts to historical events, arguing that Jewish religion and culture developed from guilt over murdering Moses, transmitted across generations, and that the repressed memory of the murder returned centuries later, forming the concept of the Messiah as Moses' return. He even suggested that Christian anti-Semitism and the myth of Jews killing Jesus was psychologically linked to Jewish guilt over killing Moses. The work has been almost universally rejected by historians and archaeologists as having no basis in historical fact and being totally devoid of serious historical method. Yet it remains fascinating as Freud's final attempt to apply psychoanalysis to civilization's deepest questions about religion, guilt, and Jewish identity, written as the Nazis were murdering European Jewry. By mid-September 1939, Freud's cancer was causing increasingly severe pain and had been declared inoperable. The last book he read was Balzac's La Paix de Chagrin, prompting reflections on his own declining condition. Freud had discussed with his physician and friend Max Schur the terminal stages of his illness, making what he called a contract that Schur would not leave him in the lurch when the time had come. On September 21, 1939, Freud turned to Dr. Schur and said that Schur remembered their contract not to leave him in the lurch, that now it was nothing but torture and made no sense, and asked Schur to make an end of it. When Schur confirmed he remembered their agreement, Freud said simply, "I thank you, talk it over with Anna, and if she thinks it's right, then make an end of it." Anna Freud was reluctant to agree to her father's death, but Schur convinced her it was pointless to prolong his suffering. On September 21 and 22, Schur administered doses of morphine, and a third and final dose was given, resulting in Freud's death at approximately 3 in the morning on September 23, 1939, at age 83. Britain had declared war on Nazi Germany on September 3, 1939, 3 weeks before Freud's death, so he died as the world descended into the most catastrophic war in human history, a grim fulfillment of his pessimistic predictions about civilization and the death drive. Sigmund Freud's life and work spanned 8 decades of extraordinary intellectual, cultural, and political transformation. Born in 1856 in a small Moravian town into a Jewish family of modest means, he lived through the height of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the collapse of old European order in World War I, the rise of modernism, and the catastrophe of fascism. His early training in scientific materialism under Ernst Bruck in the 1870s and 1880s provided the methodological foundation for what would become psychoanalysis, even as his clinical work with hysterical patients led him away from neurology towards psychology. His collaboration with Joseph Breuer on studies on hysteria in 1895 established the talking cure and the concepts of repression and catharsis, while his self-analysis following his father's death in 1896 led to the discovery of the Oedipus complex and the insights expressed in the interpretation of dreams in 1900. The early decades of the 20th century saw Freud develop the core concepts of psychoanalysis through works including The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, and the major case studies of Dora, Little Hans, and the Rat Man. His metapsychological papers of 1915 to 1907 and his introductory lectures of 1916 to 1917 systematized psychoanalytic theory and made it accessible to wider audiences. The profound impact of World War I on Freud's thinking led to the revolutionary theoretical revisions of 1920 with Beyond the Pleasure Principle, introducing the death drive, followed by the structural model of id, ego, and superego in The Ego and the Id of 1923. His later cultural works, including The Future of an Illusion and Civilization and Its Discontents, extended psychoanalytic theory to understanding religion, culture, and the fundamental conflicts between individual desire and social order. Throughout the 16 years from his cancer diagnosis in 1923 until his death in 1939, Freud continued working with remarkable productivity despite extraordinary physical suffering. His emigration from Vienna to London in 1938, fleeing Nazi persecution, the murder of his 4 sisters in the Holocaust, and his death by physician-assisted euthanasia on September 23, 1939, as World War II began, closed a life that had witnessed and profoundly influenced the intellectual and cultural transformation of the modern world. The psychoanalytic movement that Freud founded, despite internal splits with Adler and Jung and ongoing scientific controversies, spread internationally and exerted influence far beyond psychology and psychiatry, fundamentally shaping 20th century literature, art, film, and popular culture's understanding of the self, sexuality, dreams, childhood, and the unconscious. Freud's legacy remains deeply contested, with critics questioning the scientific basis of psychoanalytic theory while acknowledging his profound impact on how Western culture understands human psychology, motivation, and the hidden depths of mental life.